According to the African Union, an estimated 80 million children in Africa below 5 are malnourished. This not only stunts their growth, but also hampers their potential contribution to their economies. We speak to Dr Akinwumi Adesina, president of the African Development Bank Group, and later with Farayi Zimudzi, Food and Agriculture Organization's representative in Ethiopia, and Beth Dunford, Vice President of Agriculture, Human and Social Development at the AfDB.
I mean, you sent quite a strong message about how stunted children ultimately result in stunted economies. And the message that has been also transmitted here is the importance of a multi-sectoral approach towards investing in this area. But a lot of governments will also tell you that they are facing poly-crises right now within their respective economies. And balancing all crises and giving all crises the attention they deserve is quite difficult. As the African Development Bank, just given the investments you have made in this space as well as others, what is your message to them about how best to strike that balance, sir?
Well, you have to know what's important for you. God did not create stomachs to be empty. He created them to be filled with food. And certainly the worst thing that you want to see happen are kids not being fed and kids not going to school just because they can't eat. That crushes the heart of a mother, and it should crush the heart of any father. So I think that no nation can defend not feeding its kids. No child should ever go to bed hungry. That we must understand, fundamental to it. We spend more money on defense than we spend on kids in school. And so we have to change that for sure. But I can tell you that we are so committed to this particular agenda. And as you rightly said, Fifi, it's a multi-sectoral agenda. In 2018, we started with $700 million into water, health, sanitation, and education, all linked to malnutrition and stunting, reducing it. Today, we are putting $2.8 billion into that. So I think if you prioritize something that's important, you find the money for it.
So, of course, this meeting is happening on the sidelines of the 37th annual meetings of the African Union. Perhaps if you can help us understand what the AfDB's message will be and what the AfDB's expectations of this particular summit, this particular annual assembly is, sir.
The special focus of this assembly is on education. And so when you look at it, we have 477 million youth less than the age of 35, right? So which means that this essentially a demographic asset for us, right? But if we don't manage it well, if you don't skill them up, you don't tool them up, it's going to be a demographic chaos for us. And so the message for me is that first, we have to make sure our kids have the right skills. The right skills to enter the labor market, the right skills to take advantage of innovations and technologies, artificial intelligence, fourth industrial revolution, all of those things very, very important. Secondly, when people talk about education, they often forget that I can go to school, but if I can't find a job, of what use is the education that I have? And so we have to make sure that the educational systems provide the skills that matches the needs of the labor market. That's very, very important. And thirdly, is that not everybody wants to work for somebody else. People want to have their own enterprises, their own businesses, and so that's why for us at African Development Bank, we are supporting the establishment of what's called Youth Entrepreneurship Investment Banks. These are brand new financial institutions across Africa that would provide a mixture of technical assistance, business development, acceleration services, but also debt and equity investment for businesses of young people throughout the life cycle of their businesses. Look, the biggest asset that Africa has is not oil and gas. It's its population, it's human capital. So we have to start investing in that human capital because the rate of return is so high.
It was interesting, the comment that was made by the president of the African Development Bank regarding stunting, which is, of course, another big issue on the African continent with several millions of children suffering from stunting. And he said that stunted children, if not addressed, will lead to stunted economies. Ma'am, it's a question about what the economic implication and the economic cost of not addressing malnutrition and stunting and the severe hunger that we are seeing, particularly amongst children on the continent.
It's actually huge because we are looking at a stunted child, obviously they are not going to grow well. anyway. So there's the immediate impact that you see in the child, in the people that are malnourished. But when you think about when those people are adults, there are clear studies that have indicated a link between cognitive capacity and having suffered from malnourishment in childhood. So it's almost like we are robbing the future of the continent through stunting, malnutrition. So once again, it presents a huge challenge for all of us that we have to do something about it, because if we don't, the future of the continent is in jeopardy.
What, in your view, can be done? I mean, taking stock of the fact that there's probably polycrises that the continent is facing right now. Still low growth in many parts of the region, high inflation, you've got interest rates, you've got the cost of living crisis, you've got severe inequality, you've got unemployment, the list goes on. Against the backdrop of perhaps competing interests, as important as addressing malnutrition and stunting, what do you think that policymakers or even other stakeholders such as the private sector can do more of to address this challenge?
I think there are many levels, many facets, that different stakeholders have a role and a responsibility to play and intervene. So for me, the first one is at policy level. Beyond policy pronouncements, I think we need to move towards demonstrating the will and the commitment to actually implement those policies. I fully accept that indeed there are many competing priorities, but what can be more important than our children? What can be more important than our future as a continent, as a people? So I think it's important to make sure that the necessary investments are done beyond the rhetoric, just talking about, we need to do this, or having policies that are very good but are never quite implemented. So policies have to be implemented, and it takes political will, it takes commitment to do that. The second aspect, I think, is also at the programmatic level. I think there's no shortage of good practices that have been demonstrated across the continent. We've just heard from some of the panelists that were speaking earlier on in the session what different countries are doing. So I think we need to go beyond micro sort of activity, focusing on a small scale, and really go large scale, transformational things. We've talked about there's talk about food systems transformation, and food systems transformation is not about adjustment, it's about radical change. And all that takes commitment. It takes resources. But for me, I think before we even get to resources, once there's clear leadership, once there's clear commitment by that leadership to make a change, it can happen. I think people are hungry for clear leadership. They are hungry for people that lead from the front and show what a difference can be made. We heard earlier on one of the countries talking about one egg per child per day. Things like this. And once it's done at scale, it has a huge impact. So we need to look at what kind of programs, what does it take, and there are certain things perhaps that we are prioritizing as a continent, or that we need to shift from, and really take a critical look. How important is that relative to the future of our children, to the future of the continent?
Your reflections on what has been done. I know you're going to tell me that more needs to be done, but just your reflections on the commitments that were announced so far this evening.
So I think that, what we saw at the African Development Bank is we looked at sort of the tremendous investments we make on the continent every year and realized there's so much more we could do with them to make them really address malnutrition. And we went from, as a bank, about $700 million a year invested in nutrition-sensitive activities to really hiring nutritionists to work with project teams to make sure everything we do, where possible, has a nutrition angle. And now we're above $2.8 billion invested in nutrition-sensitive operations on the ground. And so I think that's game-changing. That's the type of, sort of systems change that we want to see at the bank. We're really working with leaders to make the commitments in their own governments to address malnutrition at the head of state level, bringing together budget lines, et cetera. and really making requests of us for multi-sectoral nutrition programs that we can then help them fund.
I was speaking to one of the industry players who's also in this space, and he was talking about, from a private sector point of view, an idea of a sugar tax or other related health taxes that we already know or undergo on the continent and elsewhere in the world, actually, and taking that revenue and investing in something like malnutrition for women who are pregnant, for instance, but just shifting that revenue into addressing a cause that you are very passionate about. I'd just like your thoughts on that, but it's more importantly around what you think the private sector can do more of at this stage.
So I think there are a lot of policy measures that can really reinforce nutrition across government and really incentivize private sector to be investing in nutrition. The private sector, has a huge role to play. I think that, there were many, many years ago where you couldn't buy on the African continent ready to eat, ready to use therapeutic food. And you had to ship it in from Europe or elsewhere, and it was very, very expensive. So the private sector really saw this as a money-making opportunity to domestically produce this life-saving food product that's extremely nutritious. And again, it's a win-win. It's a local food industry, but then it also provides that nutritional support that's needed. So there are a lot of things that can be done in that area. There's also farmers, inherently private sector, who there are a lot of nutritious varieties out there, iron-fortified beans, etc., orange flesh sweet potatoes, that those types of food, getting more of those in the food basket is very, very beneficial for nutrition.
Another number I heard being thrown around was the fact that $1 invested in malnutrition results in $16 in terms of return. So it was just about the scale of return in investing in this space. So I'm going to flip that question, and I'm going to ask you, what do you reckon the cost is right now of not taking malnutrition seriously at this particular junction that we find ourselves in?
So I think, what we're seeing is the number of stunted children growing on the continent. And a stunted child's brain, as we saw today, is underdeveloped. And so what that's doing is that's stunting the potential for these children to grow up to be productive, adults that can help to transform the societies economically and otherwise. And so, countries can't reach their full potential when you see in some countries stunting rates are, 35% and more. So that's a third of their population. Their brains haven't fully developed because they didn't have the right nutrition when they were young. So the costs are enormous, and really investing, especially during those first 1,000 days, to make sure that babies have that right nutrition as they're growing, and these children as they grow up, is critically important.